What if the qualities that a society calls natural in women, the deference, the self-erasure, the orientation toward others, are not natural at all, but the predictable outcome of a system designed to produce exactly those qualities? In Victorian England, a woman who had grown up surrounded by the assumption that her life's purpose was to support, serve, and subordinate herself to the needs of others began to write about what that assumption was actually doing to human beings and why it mattered for everyone, not only for women. Tonight, I am here with Rowan Hartsteele.
Good evening, Clara.
Harriet Taylor Mill is one of the most underrecognized thinkers in the history of Western philosophy. She is often mentioned as the partner of John Stuart Mill, as though her primary function was to inspire someone else. She was considerably more than that. She was a rigorous philosophical voice who asked precise and demanding questions about freedom, dignity, and what a human life actually requires in order to be fully lived. Tonight, we turn to a thinker whose central argument was not that women deserved rights as a concession from society, but that no human being can develop fully when their life is designed by someone else, and that this is a philosophical claim about human nature, not a political demand. The question is not only what Harriet Taylor Mill argued, but why her argument still matters, and why the question she was asking, how much of what we call choice is actually inherited expectation, has not lost its fact or urgency.
Harriet Taylor Mill's core philosophical contribution is not simply that women deserve equal rights. It is the more fundamental claim that what we call female nature is not nature but construction, that the characteristics attributed to women as natural, including passivity, self-sacrifice, and orientation toward the needs of others, are the predictable products of education, custom, and legal restriction, rather than the expression of any inherent difference.
We are speaking about Harriet Taylor Mill, born in 1807 in London, philosopher, essayist, and one of the most significant intellectual figures of the Victorian era, whose contributions to the philosophy of philosophy, freedom, and individual development have been systematically undervalued in the history of ideas.
Her arguments anticipated debates that are still active today. The questions she asked about how social expectations shape what people believe they want, about the difference between freely chosen self-sacrifice and self-sacrifice that has been normalized to the point of seeming voluntary, and about what genuine freedom of development would actually require, remain among the most important questions in political philosophy and in daily life.
Then let us begin with the world she was born into, and with what that world assumed about the nature of women.
Victorian England was a society built on assumptions about the naturalness of gender roles that were so thoroughly embedded in law, custom, education, religion, and daily practice that they were nearly invisible to those within the system. A woman upon marriage became legally fused with her husband. She could not own property in her own name, could not enter into contracts independent, could not sue or be sued separately, and had no independent legal existence. Her children, legally, belonged to her husband. Her earnings, legally, belonged to her husband. The education available to women of Harriet's class was designed not to develop their capacities for independent thought, but to make them agreeable companions and efficient household managers. The qualities rewarded in women, compliance, selflessness, emotional attunement to the needs of others, ornamental accomplishment in music and language, were precisely the qualities that made them useful to a domestic system in which their primary function was to support the work and development of the men around them.
So the education system was training women not to flourish but to be useful to others.
Yes. And here is the first thing we need to correct about the standard account of Harriet Taylor Mill. She is sometimes presented as a polemical activist, a woman who wanted rights for ideological reasons. The historical record shows something different. A rigorous philosophical thinker who approached questions about freedom and development from first principles. Her argument was not primarily that women were being treated unfairly, though they were. Her argument was that a system which restricts the development of any class of human beings is damaging, both to those individuals and to the broader society that depends on the capacities it is suppressing. Harriet married John Taylor in 1826 at the age of 18. A marriage that was conventional in its origins, but that quickly revealed itself to be a constraint on a mind that had developed far beyond what the role of wife and mother could contain. She met John Stuart Mill in 1830 at a dinner party. The intellectual connection between them was immediate and profound. They began a friendship, and eventually an intellectual partnership that lasted until her death in 1858. The relationship between Harriet Taylor and John Stuart Mill was conducted within the social constraints of the era, which meant years of close friendship and intellectual collaboration, while she remained married to John Taylor. John Taylor himself eventually accommodated this arrangement, and after his death in 1849, Harriet and Mill married in 1851. Mill would later describe Harriet as the primary intellectual influence of his mature work, and his attribution was genuine. The Subjection of Women, published after her death, is dedicated to her memory and draws extensively on arguments she had developed.
So the collaboration was real, and the attribution was not merely courtesy.
Yes. Harriet's essay The Enfranchisement of Women, published in 1851, represents the clearest single statement of her philosophical position. It argues directly that the social and legal subordination of women is not grounded in any natural difference between men and women, but in a system of custom, law, and education that has been maintained by those who benefit from it. She challenges directly the claim, common in her time, that women's exclusion from public life reflects their natural inclinations and capacities. Her argument about natural character is one of the most philosophically precise elements of her work. She observes that we have no way of knowing what women's natural capacities or inclinations are, because we have never seen women develop in conditions of genuine freedom. Everything we know about women's nature, she argues, is knowledge about what women become under conditions of systematic restriction. Drawing conclusions about inherent difference from evidence gathered under such conditions is not empirically valid. It is simply a record of what restriction produces.
So the argument about nature is also an argument about the limits of the evidence available to make that argument.
Yes. And this is one of the most sophisticated elements of her thinking. She is not simply asserting that women are equal to men. She is arguing that the question of natural equality cannot be meaningfully answered under conditions of inequality, because the conditions themselves distort the evidence. This is an epistemological claim as much as a political one, and it remains one of the clearest statements of a problem that continues to challenge research on gender difference. Her critique of 19th century marriage is the part of her work that most directly addresses the structures of daily life. She was not arguing against marriage as such. She was arguing against the specific legal and social form that marriage took in her era, in which a woman entered a union that extinguished her legal identity, her property rights, and her capacity for independent decision-making. She described this arrangement as a form of dependency that could only be called freely chosen if the alternative, social ostracism, poverty, and exclusion from every respected role available to a woman, were not counted as coercion.
So a choice made without genuine alternatives is not really a choice.
Yes, and this insight about the relationship between genuine choice and the availability of alternatives is one of the foundational arguments of liberal political philosophy. A freedom that exists in principle but not in practice. A freedom to make choices that carry prohibitive costs unless one chooses in the expected direction is not genuine freedom. Harriet understood this with unusual clarity for her era, and stated it with unusual directness. Her broader philosophy of human development held that a human being cannot fully develop if their life is designed by others. This is not a claim about women specifically. It is a claim about the conditions for human flourishing generally. A person whose education, social role, legal status, and range of permitted activities are determined by their membership in a group, rather than by their individual capacities and choices, is a person whose development has been constrained at the level of what they are permitted to become. The specific social world Harriet inhabited placed unusual constraints on a woman of her intellectual capacity. Women of her class were not expected to publish under their own names, and much of the intellectual exchange that sustained serious thinkers took place in social settings from which women were largely excluded, or in which their contributions were attributed to male companions. The essay on the enfranchisement of women was published in the Westminster Review in 1851, initially without her name attached to it. The attribution of the ideas to Mill, rather than to Harriet, began almost immediately, and has persisted in some quarters ever since.
So, the invisibility she was analyzing was something she was experiencing personally as a thinker.
Yes, and this is one of the more instructive ironies of her biography. The philosopher who argued most clearly that women's intellectual capacity was being suppressed and misattributed was herself the subject of exactly that suppression and misattribution. The fact that Mill consistently and explicitly attributed his intellectual debts to her does not change the fact that the broader intellectual culture found it easier to credit the ideas to him. The relationship between Harriet's ideas and those of John Stuart Mill requires careful treatment. Mill's major works, particularly on liberty, published in 1859, The Subjection of Women, published in 1869, and the autobiography, published in 1873, all bear the marks of her influence. Mill himself stated in the autobiography that the subjection of women was hers, in the sense that it was the result of their joint work, with her as the primary initiating intelligence. Scholars debate the precise allocation of intellectual credit, but the collaboration was genuine and the influence was substantive.
So the intellectual partnership was real enough that distinguishing her contributions from his becomes genuinely difficult.
Yes, and this difficulty is itself philosophically significant. The history of ideas has tended to organize itself around individual authors of named texts, which makes collaborative intellectual work, particularly collaborative work in which one partner had limited access to the publication mechanisms available to the other, difficult to recover accurately. Harriet's case is an extreme version of a more general problem about how intellectual contribution is recognized and attributed. Her analysis of the difference between loving a person and being subjugated to them is one of the most psychologically acute elements of her philosophical work. She was not arguing against love, or against deep. She was arguing against a system in which love and legal subjugation had been made inseparable, in which a woman's access to the relationship she valued required the surrender of the independence that would have made her a full participant in it. She believed that genuine relationship required genuine equality, and that without equality what called itself love was often something closer to dependency.
So her argument about marriage was not anti-love, but pro-equality within love.
Yes, and this distinction matters enormously for how her work is received. She is sometimes misread as arguing for a cold and transactional model of human relationships. She was arguing for the opposite, for relationships between people who were fully themselves, who brought their complete capacities and their genuine preferences to their connection, rather than a carefully shaped version of themselves designed to satisfy the role they had been assigned. She believed that equality was not the enemy of intimacy, but its condition.
Before we close tonight, let us take a brief pause and welcome Margaret Evernight. Margaret, for those who want to encounter Harriet Taylor Mill's arguments in her own words, where would you invite them to continue?
Thank you, Clara. In this case, the most direct path is also the most important one. I would suggest beginning with The Enfranchisement of Women by Harriet Taylor Mill herself.
So this is the primary text in which she states her philosophical position directly and without mediation.
In this pioneering essay, Harriet Taylor Mill argues that the social and legal subordination of women is not natural but constructed, and that true freedom requires equal opportunity for self-development, dignity, and independent thought. The text is relatively short, written with great clarity, and delivers its argument with a directness and precision that is immediately recognizable as the work of a serious philosophical mind rather than a political mind. Pamphleteer.
Is it accessible to readers without a background in Victorian history or feminist theory?
The essay requires no specialist background. Harriet writes as someone who assumes her reader is intelligent but not necessarily expert, and the argument unfolds with a logical clarity that is unusually easy to follow. The prose reflects the Victorian period, but is not opaque to a modern reader. A person encountering it without any prior knowledge will find themselves inside the argument within the first few pages.
So it gives the reader the argument from the source, in the philosopher's own voice, and in her own form.
Precisely. And reading it today, knowing that it was written in 1851, is itself a philosophically significant experience. The argument does not feel dated. The structures it is analyzing have changed in form, but not always in substance.
Thank you, Margaret. That is a thoughtful place to pause tonight.
Thank you, Clara. It was a pleasure.
The question Harriet was asking, how much of what we call choice is actually inherited expectation, is not a historical question. It is a question about the relationship between social formation and individual agency that applies to every person in every era. The specific forms of inherited expectation change across time and culture. The mechanism does not. Every social system shapes what its members believe they want, what they understand as possible, and what they experience as natural. The contemporary forms of the structures Harriet analyzed include the unequal distribution of invisible labor in domestic life, the social expectation that women will manage the emotional needs of the people around them, at the cost of their own development, the pressure to prioritize relationships over individual ambition, and the difficulty of rebuilding an identity after years of living primarily in relation to someone else. These are not the same as the legal erasure of marriage in Victorian England. They are less extreme, but they are recognizably continuous with it.
So the structures Harriet identified in their most extreme legal form have softened without entirely disappearing.
Yes, and the philosophical tools she developed for analyzing them remain useful, precisely because she was analyzing the structure rather than the specific legal form. Her argument that a choice made without genuine alternatives is not genuine freedom applies as readily to the invisible pressures of contemporary social expectation as it does to the explicit legal constraints of Victorian marriage. The question she was asking, whether what appears to be a free choice reflects an actual preference or an internalized expectation about what one is supposed to want, is as alive today as it was in 1851. The concept of self-development that runs through Harriet's work is worth examining in its own terms. She believed that the development of individual capacities, intellectual, creative, professional, and emotional, was not a luxury but a basic requirement of a fully human life. A person who is prevented from developing their capacities by law, custom, expectation, or circumstance is a person whose humanity has been partially denied. This claim is not specific to any particular political ideology. It is a claim about what human beings are and what they require in order to be what they are.
Though self-development for Harriet was not about ambition or achievement in the conventional sense, it was about the basic conditions for being fully human.
Yes, this is why her argument is not a feminist argument in any narrow sense. It is an argument about human nature and the conditions for human flourishing that happens to have been applied most urgently and most explicitly to the situation of women in her era, because that was where the class constraint was most visible and most severe. But the logic applies to any situation in which a person's development is subordinated to a role defined by others. The legacy of Harriet Taylor Mill's work is partly visible and partly subterranean. The visible legacy is in the tradition of liberal feminism that runs from her work through the 20th century, in the legal reforms that expanded women's property rights, political participation, and economic opportunities, and in the philosophical tradition that treats individual autonomy as a basic moral and political value. The subterranean legacy is in the continuing relevance of questions she posed that have not yet received satisfactory answers. The central conclusion her work supports is direct. No meaningful life can be built by disappearing into someone else's expectations. This is not a political slogan. It is a philosophical claim about what a meaningful life requires. A life organized entirely around the needs, goals, and expectations of others is a life in which the person living it has not fully existed. The development of a self requires conditions in which that self has room to form, to make genuine choices, to fail and recover, and to become something that was not entirely predetermined by the roles and expectations into which one was born.
So her argument is ultimately an argument about what it means to exist as a person rather than simply as a function.
Yes, and the secondary conclusion that follows is equally important. Freedom does not begin when society allows it. Freedom begins when a person recognizes their own right to exist fully. The legal and social permissions that Harriet was arguing for matter enormously, but they are conditions that make freedom possible, not the freedom itself. The freedom itself is a recognition, a decision to take seriously the fact of one's own existence and the claim it makes on the world. That recognition is not something that any law can grant or withhold. It is something that a person has to arrive at from the inside. Harriet Taylor Mill passed away in 1858 in Avignon, France, at the age of 51, of a lung condition that had troubled her for years. Mill was devastated. He bought a house near the cemetery where she was buried, and spent part of each year there for the rest of his life. His dedication to her memory was absolute. The work she had begun on women's rights and individual freedom, he continued in her name. And the tradition she had helped establish continued long after both of them were gone.
Thank you for staying with us tonight. And thank you, Rowan, for guiding us through the Victorian structures of legal dependency, the philosophical argument about natural character and constructed constraint, and the conclusion that no one can fully exist if their life has been designed entirely by someone else.
Harriet Taylor Mill reminds us that the most radical thing a person can do in a system designed to make them invisible is to take seriously the fact that they are there.
If this conversation stayed with you, you are welcome to like, comment, and subscribe. You will find other episodes here where history, ideas, and power are approached slowly. Until next time, stay with us.